I did want to just echo something that Shrija had said earlier. I have a teenager at home too, and when she's not asking us why she can't drive a car without a driver's license, she's asking us what we are going to do about climate change. And so just recognizing that this really is about our future and the future of our kids. So that's just something that really hit home to me. So since I have limited time, what I want you all to be thinking about, this is your homework for my presentation. Are we using the right data? What data do you have? And what does it mean for your community so that we can build these into products? So I am on the consultant team that's working with the county on doing the climate modeling for floods, for fires, and one of the taskings that we had was understanding the intersection between the work we're doing on climate hazards and community vulnerability. How is it impacting our frontline communities? And so we've been pulling together sets of indicators and developing some geospatial products to figure that out. A few things I just wanted to note about the work we're doing is really helping understand like how climate is a multiplier for kind of the impacts on different communities, and that it's not just about any one indicator, that we are thinking about the intersectionality of the range of issues that we're talking about. Another thing I think that's important to know is that when we're talking about an indicator in a community, whether we're talking about a low-income community, a community of color, a community where we have a high percentage of elderly individuals, that's not the story of the community. That's a data point, and it's not necessarily reflective of the sum and total of what's going on there. Another thing that we're doing is we're not out there creating new indicators for you. There's a lot of work that's been done to gather data, to create data points, and so we've been drawing on a range of resources to craft these. Just one vocabulary point, I'm talking about indicators, which are kind of individual data points, like I said, percent of the population under 5 years old, versus an index, which would be kind of an aggregate of indicators to understand cumulative vulnerability. And also just understanding that nothing in this data is meant to replace the value, the need to ground truth this at the community level. I did want to give a couple actual acknowledgments before I dig in. One to GEI Consulting, who did a lot of the hazard modeling that we based these maps on. Also, I just spent some time, and I believe there's some people in the room that were involved in this. The Asian Pacific Environmental Network did this amazing report mapping resilience. I've had a chance to dig into some of that work. I'm really looking forward to continuing conversations with those that were involved to continue to advance the conversations we're having here. But where are we at? So in your materials, you have a matrix that has 21 indicators that we've selected. We've pulled from the census, we've pulled from Cal EPA, we've pulled from San Mateo County data. And really, like I said, your tasking here is to help us start to validate and advance the discussion on what indicators do we want to be using to better understand vulnerability to climate hazards in San Mateo County. This is a work in progress, and I'm kind of proposing it as a thought exercise, and your table facilitators are going to take you through it, where we have a group of indicators broken out by mobility, economic burden, housing, demographics, health impacts. So take a look at those. When we get through the discussion, do these indicators make sense? What might be missing? Also, it's arranged with an exercise to think about how these indicators might be relevant across different phases of a disaster to help us position ourselves for action before, during, and after a disaster. And finally, which indicators are most helpful in understanding our vulnerability to particular hazard events? In this project, we've been looking at flooding and sea level rise, where we might want to consider proximity to hazardous waste sites. For heat, we want to know where our elderly or young individuals are. For wildfire, where might transit-dependent populations be. So helping us understand, what do you think is important? If we're helping communicate to the community what vulnerability looks like, what makes sense to you. So your table facilitators will help take you through this. Like I said, it's a work in progress. We're not presenting this as a finished product. It's meant to be an activity to go through, and hopefully your feedback today will help us move it down the road. So just kind of sharing a little bit about those phases of disaster. Like I said, think about indicators that are going to help you understand what to do in the readiness and preparedness phase. You know, whether that is pushing out outreach and education materials that are culturally appropriate, that are translated. During a disaster, do we know where our residents with disabilities are in terms of access to transportation, to sheltering assets? Post-disaster, do we understand the situation with housing or insurance, to understand what elements of our population could be more impacted than others during a disaster? So while there's probably many of these indicators that are applicable across phases, across hazards, we're also trying to give folk the tools, the vocabulary to kind of think about social vulnerability through a number of lenses there. So a few things that we've developed or working with the data we have. One is kind of looking at indexing some of our indicators to identify hotspots across the county. Right now we have about 10 indicators included in this analysis. We can add more. We can talk about how we're parsing it out. I really liked the approach in the Mapping Resilience report that talked about looking at exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. How might we want to group these indicators to really kind of present vulnerability? And then what we did in terms of geospatial analysis was taking this data at the census tract, and then because census tracts can be a little big, they don't necessarily show you where the people are, we overlaid that with developed land to kind of get a better sense of what that could look like. So I'm just going to show you a couple examples of some of these indexes. This is kind of in the North County. You can see kind of the dark green is 7+ indicators present. So up in the Daly City area and South San Francisco, you can see some hot spots. We're going to be working on figures like this for the whole county. Here's another one down North Fair Oaks, East Palo Alto. So you can see some of the community breakdowns that we have. One thing just to know about these analyses as you look at the data that the state was presenting is just the idea that we are trying to drill down to a more community-centric level using community-level data, the downscaled climate data that we have. I'm not going to belabor, we've had a number of the presenters talk about the range of impacts from these different hazards. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you some products. I did want to say just one thing on wildfire. When we think about what's a story of these impacts coming to life in Washington State in 2014 during the fires, there was a large issue with farm workers not receiving language-appropriate messaging. Not only that, there was only one Spanish-speaking radio station. They didn't even get the information. So there's an example of how understanding what our community's needs are, understanding these indicators, is going to drive not only the pre-planning, but the delivery of effective response activities. Here's an example of one of the maps we've done for wildfire vulnerability. This is down in the Half Moon Bay area. So what you can see is, if you look at the light orange, those are developed areas that are adjacent to high fire risk areas. The darker orange are areas where one of our indicators was present. And so you can start to think about what this could look like. So we could, develop maps that are specific to transit-dependent populations that are going to help show this. So this is an example of wildfire vulnerability in Half Moon Bay. Flooding, another area where we've talked about some of those impacts. In Sonoma County, in I think it's 2018 or 2019, one of the things we've talked about is environmental justice, exposure to hazardous waste. And they actually issued a hazardous materials, I'm going to butcher the name of what it was called, but actually an emergency specific to household hazardous waste that was getting into the water and impacting communities. So definitely a real problem. It's not just industrial waste, it's also a residential problem. Here is an example in Redwood City of flood risk that we have done at the local level. And so you'll see these areas. I'm a little colorblind, so I don't know if this shows up better for you all. but the light kind of teal color is areas of high flood risk that are intersected with low-income communities, and these red dots are hazardous waste sites within those. So you can kind of see the intersection of income, flood risk, and proximity to hazardous waste sites. Another example of how that can start to drive a conversation about what to do about planning for flood in San Mateo County. I presented on heat at the last convening. You guys can all go to the website and look at the video of what I said. But looking at heat, we've talked about the impacts to our elderly, to those that have health conditions. And here is a map from San Mateo that shows how we can intersect, in this case, number of high heat days a year with populations less than 5 years old. So where are those fragile youth that are present in the community so we can start to target strategies? These are all just examples that we pulled together to show you how we hope this data can come to life, both as tools for discussions like this, for ground truthing in the communities, to advance the conversation. And we're happy to get your feedback today on what is the most impactful way to share this. So how are we driving this? Using data to drive additional action, whether that's qualitative actions like focus groups or community mapping activities, or quantitative actions like additional surveys. How can the data support that? Again, not intended to replace but augment, to support community dialogue, leveraging community wisdom on what is your lived experience in your community, and how can we intersect that with the data that we have. We are going to be advancing this conversation and integrating all of this into a climate viewer, as Jasneet mentioned. I would encourage you all to participate in the task force meeting that is coming up on October 30th, where we're actually going to be showing a beta product of that, and you can come, you can look at it, you can throw darts at it, and you can tell us what you want it to look like. So that is my whirlwind. I think I stayed on time, and I am going to look at Jasneet whirling her and keep going. Okay. So feel free to come find me afterward on the break if you want to talk further. Your feedback on all of the things we discussed is encouraged, welcome, not easily offended. Did you have a
Have you considered adding immigrant status as one of the factors?
So the question was, have we considered adding immigrant status as one of the factors? And we absolutely can and will consider that. So we're going to move into the table discussion, and I have to get back and facilitate my table. So what we're going to do is spend approximately 15 minutes working through these following questions. As much as I want all your feedback on the matrix, I do want to encourage you to kind of spend as much time as you need to on this first question, because we've been talking a lot about vulnerability. But what about resilience? What about what makes your community strong? And so the questions that we'd like you to look at are, what are aspects, the attributes of your community that make it strong or create a foundation for resilience? And then once you've gotten through that dialogue, pull out that matrix, pull it apart, move boxes around, identify new indicators, do all the things that are going to help us improve how we're communicating about social vulnerability in San Mateo County. So with that, table facilitators, you are off to the races.